The ailerons are controlled by side-to-side motion of the control stick. The front stick is linked to the rear cockpit stick by a torque tube. From the bottom of the rear stick, the motion is taken by a push-pull rod to the central bell crank. We can see clearly here the secondary travel stops. From the central bell crank, the motion is taken to the aileron bell cranks by a pair of cables. The aileron bell cranks are then linked to each other by a third cable. The aileron bell crank is connected to the aileron by a push-pull rod. We can see the primary stops here. Aerodynamic balance is provided by balance tabs on each aileron. Note that these are balance tabs only and not trim tabs. Aerodynamic balance is also assisted by the setback hinges of the ailerons, allowing the leading edge of the aileron to dip below the wing profile during aileron motion. The elevator is controlled by fore and aft motion of the stick. The front stick is connected to the rear stick by a push-pull rod moving up the center of the torque tube. At the bottom of each stick is the secondary stop. At the bottom of the rear stick, a push-pull rod connects to the forward bell crank. From the forward bell crank, two cables connect to the aft bell crank. Note the down bias springs connected to the aft bell crank. The aft bell crank is connected by a push-pull rod to the elevator input lever. Note the primary travel stop. Aerodynamic balance is provided by a shielded horn on the front of each elevator. Rudder movement is controlled by the rudder pedals. The front cockpit is connected through to the rear cockpit by a lever and push-pull rod under the floor. The rear pedestal is connected by a second push-pull rod to the forward bell crank. The forward bell crank is connected by two cables to the rudder lower hinge. Note the primary stop arm. Aerodynamic balance is provided by a shielded horn on the top of the rudder and assisted by the balance action of the trim tab. Aileron trim is controlled by the switch on the top of each control stick. The aft cockpit switch has overriding control. The trim switches supply an electric screw jack in the center of the wing. The screw jack positions the trimming bell crank. The trimming bell crank is connected by springs to the aileron central bell crank. A position sensor in the screw jack signals the position gauge on the dash panel. Elevator trim is also controlled by the switches on the top of each stick, with the switch on the rear stick having overriding control. The switches supply a screw jack in the horizontal stabilizer, which positions the trim tab by a push-pull rod. Position indication is again provided by a sensor in the electric screw jack. Rudder trim is controlled by a rocker switch on the front of each throttle. The rear cockpit switch again having overriding control. The switches supply an electric screw jack in the vertical stabilizer. The screw jack positions the trim tab by a push-pull rod connected through the central rudder hinge. Position indication is again provided by a sensor in the electric screw jack. If any of the three trim screw jacks should fail in a runaway condition, all three can be isolated using the trim isolation switch on the left side panel. The control lock is a lever which engages on the front stick. This locks the ailerons and elevator. The rudder is locked by the nose wheel steering.